Wise English Stories.
Marcus Mac Jennings wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back under the glaring workshop lights, taking a deep breath to steady himself. It was past midnight, and the clatter of tools had long since faded in the small-town garage, leaving only Mac and the silence. He had been working on a particularly stubborn engine in an old Chevrolet, his hands covered in grease, his body exhausted, but he couldn't go home just yet. He needed the extra hours, every single one of them, because they meant something much more important than his exhaustion. They meant hope. 3 months earlier, his 7-year-old son, Lucas, had been diagnosed with a rare blood disorder. The news had been devastating. Doctors had explained the situation with grave tones, and Mac and his wife, Julia, had sat there in shock, grasping each other's hands. Treatment was available, but it was complex and costly, and insurance covered only a fraction of it. They'd already sold their second car and moved into a smaller place. Julia had started working nights, even though it meant she barely saw Lucas, and Mac was taking every repair job that came his way. It wasn't the life Mac had envisioned, but Lucas was his world. If Mac had to crawl through broken glass to get him the treatment he needed, he would. And so, each day, he pushed himself a little harder, stayed at the garage a little longer, praying that it would be enough. Tonight, he was working on the car of a man named Mr. Callahan, a retired lawyer with more than enough money to go elsewhere. But Callahan liked Mac's honesty, his no-nonsense approach, and had brought in a few of his classic cars for repair. Callahan also knew that Mac's bills were piling up and paid generously, often slipping an extra $100 bill into the payment envelope. Mac had been too proud to say anything, but tonight, as he finished replacing the worn-out part in the Chevy's engine, he felt the weight of it all settling in. With the last bolt in place, Mac wiped his hands on his all-stained rag and prepared to close up shop when he heard a small voice from the darkness. It was Mr. Callahan, leaning against the doorway, his face lit by the single hanging light. "Working late again, Mac?" Callahan's voice was soft but held a note of genuine concern. Mac gave him a tired smile. "It's gotta be done, Mr. Callahan. This car's got to run like new by morning." Callahan nodded, studying him. "Mac, I've been coming here for over 20 years, and I've seen my share of mechanics. You're one of the hardest working men I know. But I also know about your son, Lucas. You don't have to hide your struggles here." The comment caught Mac off guard. He looked down, trying to find the right words. "I'm not asking for pity, sir. Just doing what needs to be done," Mac replied, his voice rough with the exhaustion he'd been holding back for so long. "I've set up an account, Mac," he said quietly. "It'll cover the medical bills for Lucas. You don't have to worry about working yourself into the ground. You can focus on being there for him. And all I ask is that when the day comes and you're able, you pass the kindness along to someone else." The words took a moment to sink in. Mac's hand shook, and he felt a wave of emotions rush over him, his throat tightening. For months, he had held everything together for his family, swallowed his fear, his worrying, even his pride, and he'd done it all without expecting a single hand to reach out. He blinked, feeling the sting of tears he hadn't let himself cry. "Mr. Callahan," Mac's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say. Just say yes, Mac," Callahan replied gently, a small smile on his face. "Say yes, and take care of your bull," Mac nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope, real, solid hope. The weight on his shoulders lifted just enough to let him breathe again. As Callahan patted his shoulder and left the garage, Mac sat alone under the dim light, feeling the strength return to him, piece by piece. He would take the help, not for himself but for his son. And he knew that one day, he would find a way to repay this kindness, because if there was anything he'd learn it was that people like Callahan, people who saw beyond the grease and the dirt, who understood the dignity of hard work, were what made the world just a little bit brighter. He stood, packed up his tools, and headed home to Julie and Lucas, and that night, he held his son's hand a little tighter, knowing that while the road ahead was still long, he wouldn't be walking it alone.